You're following us. I'm Professor David Millo from the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. I'm actually going to give an opening address, and I'm doing it on behalf of the Executive Dean of the TM School, who is Professor Vil Nkomo. He is unfortunately not available with us or in the country to be able to do the opening himself. Now, let me start by acknowledging those who are here and those who are not here. And maybe I should start with those who are not here. The principal of this university in absentia, the vice principals of this university, the executive deans of the two faculties and school, dignitaries who are in this room. We have the Honorable Ambassador, who is going to be introduced shortly. We have a visiting scholar. We have the COD of the History Department, and colleagues from UNISA, people from outside. I've just met a very seasoned a journalist, John Jack Cornish, who is also with us here, people from outside and those who are online. Today marks the culmination of an agreement that was entered into between the History Department, the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, Accord, and these three entities decided that the importance of a discussion and a dialogue around BRICS cannot only happen outside us, but we must be an integral part of this dialogue. Now, when you look at the title of this event, you would realize that it is talking about the past, the present, as well as the future. Now, when you look at this title of the event itself, you can easily locate a historian in there, because a historian will also always be interested in what has happened in the past and how is this past going to be impacting on us in the present, in the immediate future, and again in the long term. Again, when you look at the concept of peace and security, then you can be able to locate Accord in the title of the event. Again, within the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, we have a number of focus areas. Peace and security are very crucial to us in terms of what we are focusing on. And therefore, it implies that the three entities, when they initially met, they had a noble idea of making sure that we become the center of the conversation. In fact, we drive the narrative in as far as the involvement of Africa in as far as the global stage is concerned. Now, when you look at BRICS, you realize that BRICS was actually born in the year 2009. And when you do your calculation, you will realize that BRICS is actually a teenager. Now, BRICS being a teenager has actually proven to us that true to the nature of a teenager, BRICS has been able to ruffle some feathers. BRICS has become topical not only in Africa, but it has become topical across the world, because everybody is watching this teenager. This teenager is becoming problematic to the world. This teenager is also becoming problematic to itself, because as you may have followed some of the events, we have war going on in Ukraine. Russia is involved there. We have other battles, other wars that are taking place, as well as coups in Africa. Now, the concept of peace, in as far as Africa is concerned, becomes much more important, and that is why the discussion around BRICS becomes very important. Now, the timing is also extremely important in as far as this dialogue is concerned, because this dialogue basically precedes the summit that will be taking place in the week of the 22nd. And all eyes in Africa, in the world, are actually watching what is going to happen with regard to the summit. What are going to be the results, and what is going to be the lasting impact in as far as the summit is concerned. Most importantly, as we watch, as we become part and parcel of this youth who is called BRICS, as South Africa, as Southern Africa, as the region of Africa, we also need to find ourselves in the midst of the dialogue. We should be able to say, what is our role? We cannot be bystanders in as far as our future, our development is concerned. And it's therefore important that we, as academics, become a part and parcel of this dialogue. The practitioners, ordinary citizens in South Africa, civil society, should also come on board to say, we are now going to become part and parcel of the dialogue. We're going to carve a niche in as far as the involvement of Africa, the involvement of individual countries in Africa, in as far as BRICS is concerned. Within the context of UNISA, the dialogue also takes place at a very opportune time. In the month of July, UNISA has just celebrated 150 years. So we're very old. We're older than any person who is alive. And therefore, as we also grow older as an institution, our focus is mainly on Africa. The Thabo Mbeki's focus is on Africa. The history department is also much more interested in Africa. Ambassador Nhlapo is also a person who is well-traveled, a person who is much more knowledgeable about international relations. And within our school, we also have a focus area that is on international relations. And therefore, it means that as we all sit together, we are actually bringing together a transdisciplinary team of people internally and people outside the University of South Africa. And it is through this transdisciplinary team that we are going to be able to chart a way forward. Now, what is very interesting when I looked at the topic, when I look at what is actually going to happen even tomorrow, is that this is not only going to be a talk shop, but this is going to be an engagement, is going to be a dialogue that is going to lead to knowledge generation. And I'm sure my colleague Kwesi, when he talks tomorrow or sometime during the deliberations, he's going to talk about the outputs that we're going to have. It implies that we are investing, but as we are investing as UNISA, we are looking forward to reaping some rewards in as far as the investment is concerned. And therefore, it implies that when we look at the 5 countries that are making up BRICS, and you looking at the population of these 5 countries, you realize that it is more about 41% of the world population. When you look at the trade, you'd realize that China is actually dominating, followed by Russia. And South Africa is coming right at the bottom end in as far as the trade relations and capacity. But the question is, should South Africa always be at the bottom? And through the dialogue that we are going to have, we must find ourselves at the center. We must find ourselves improving so that we are not just one of those countries. And I think there is mention of BRICS Plus. And therefore, it means that as we begin, as we start this dialogue, there are so many questions that we have to answer, and it is through the deliberations that we are going to have that all these questions are going to be answered. On behalf of the TM School, the History Department, ACOT, as well as the University of South Africa, I wish to welcome you to this very important event, and please feel free to engage robustly in the debates as well as interactions. Thank you very much. Over to you, Kwesi.
Good morning, colleagues and esteemed guests, and for all those attending online. I highly appreciate your presence and attendance for this important occasion. If I'm audible, I hope I'm audible. Great. Yes, welcome, and I thank Prof. Mello for that fantastic introduction and for placing the right amount of value for this occasion. Essentially, we are trying to create a forward-thinking set of a series of events that would provide information, knowledge products, and provide direction, strategic direction for the kinds of conversations we want to have. And in this instance, we are referring to peace and security engagement in African spaces. That said, I think I need to quickly get to the program at hand, and that being to welcome and introduce our very esteemed guest. I had the opportunity to meet our esteemed guest some months ago at an event in Durban, and I distinctly remember him to be a very direct individual and sharp in a sense that it came with a certain gravitas, a certain level of experience, which for me was astounding. Ladies and gentlemen, the guest I have today will sort of introduce the topic, will explain the varying dynamics to the topic, and will provide his personal reflection and experience on the topic at hand. I have had the chance to engage him on a few of the questions I'm about to ask, and I can guarantee he is an apt and able conversant. Ambassador Welile Nhlapo, who is my esteemed guest, joined Accord, our partner, in 2009 as a senior political advisor. In 2013, Ambassador Nhlapo served as a South African representative on the Kimberley process, specifically serving as the Kimberley process chairperson. From 2011 to 2012, Ambassador Nhlapo served as South Africa's special representative to the the Great Lakes region at the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation. Ambassador Nhlapo has extensive experience of working in the Great Lakes region, having also headed President Jacob Zuma's Burundi technical team, when the then Deputy President Zuma was mediator in the Burundi peace process. From 2010 to 2011, Ambassador Nhlapo was President Zuma's national security advisor. Moving back in time, in the early 70s, Ambassador Nhlapo was involved in the establishment of youth organizations in South Africa. After going into exile in Botswana in 1974, Ambassador Nhlapo served as the ANC chief representative in Botswana. In 1982, he was appointed as head of the African National Congress's Youth League in South Africa. Ambassador Nhlapo joined the South African Department of Foreign Affairs in 1994. In 1995, he was appointed as the South African ambassador to Ethiopia and a permanent representative to the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. In 1998, Ambassador Nhlapo was appointed Deputy Director General responsible for Africa in the South African Department of Foreign Affairs. In 2001, he was appointed head of the Presidential Support Unit, which advised the presidency on conflict situations in Africa and the Middle East. Ambassador Nhlapo served as South Africa's ambassador to the African Union mission in Burundi, as well as ambassador to the United States of America, which was in 2007 to 2009. Ladies and gentlemen, let's please give a very warm welcome to our esteemed guest, Ambassador Welile Nhlapo. I think that introduction serves its purpose in terms of the wealth of knowledge he will bring to this conversation. But I think it's important to first understand the context, the environment, the global situation, or at least the global theater of interaction and conflict. I'd like to pose a question to the ambassador, but before I do that, let me first pass the mic for him to greet you all.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. You said certain things. I'm trying to remember when those things happened, but I wouldn't dispute any of them. From what my memory can inform me. Those activities can be associated with me. And I think it is on that basis that I find myself on the spot today, but it's fine. Let me start by saying initially I'm supposed to be standing in on behalf of Vasu Gondan, who was supposed to be here as part of a panel that has been dismantled by other activities that took place or emerged in the last few days and hours. So I find myself here, almost on my own and with the other panelists, not being here. But in the conversation that we have had, we had agreed that we'll try to do exactly what was intended for the program as best as we can, with your assistance and those online, because you'll be able to ask the questions, make the comments, and augment whatever we are going to have. As the Prof has indicated, this is an engagement and a dialogue. I think an opportunity presented by the South Africa hosting the BRICS summit, as indicated. And sometimes, whenever there's been conversations about South Africa hosting the BRICS, it has never been about the real issue. It was about somebody coming or not coming, being arrested or not arrested, things that had really nothing to do with the importance of this meeting of the BRICS that South Africa is hosting. Of course, it is important also to reflect on that, because that in itself tells you something about what the Prof alluded to, about the fears about what this BRICS summit is going to produce, and the shift that it will contribute towards what normally is being talked about, which will have the opportunity to look maybe a little bit deeper as to what do we mean by the shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world. Because we're talking about practical lived experiences here. That are going to inform how we are going to evolve as humanity and the challenges that we are going to have to be facing. And hopefully we should be able to go through those things. Let me start by saying that, talks about BRICS and peace and security in Africa and how we can work together and cooperate in ensuring that BRICS also becomes alive as a collective to these challenges, and as much as possible without diverting from its main purpose. But also reflect on this, because it's a reality that you can't run away from. You can't talk about development and stability without peace and security. And BRICS being primarily, initially have been focused on development and looking at the institutions, and particularly the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions as part of a starting point of looking at the shift that has been alluded to, as to how is it really going to be actualized. I was fortunate to be part of a delegation that attended a meeting in Brazil. We were going to an IPSA meeting, India, Brazil, South Africa meeting, to participate as part of that partnership, South Cooperation Partnership that existed at the time. But at the same time, Brazil was also hosting the BRIC. Brazil, Russia, India, China. So we got an indication when we arrived in Brasilia that the president of China wanted to have a dialogue with the president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, and his delegation on a number of bilateral and multilateral issues, and insisted that they want to come to our embassy, which was something that was not expected from our side, but insisted they wanted to come to our residence. And indeed, he came there with his huge delegation. And amongst the things that he hinted towards the end of the meeting was that we were going to be invited to the meeting of the BRIC. And in that meeting, a proposal will be hinted that in the next meeting, we are going to be invited to join. I'm using invited twice because sometimes this thing does not exist in the vocabulary of South Africa as how we became part of the BRICS. Sometimes we say we formed the BRICS. We invited into a formation that existed. And it assumed that acronym because of our addition. And I think it's always important to have that understanding. Because it's got its own implications. It had raised a number of questions, one of which Prof. alluded to. How do we become part of this big club with this kind of big countries in it, and South Africa representing the small country that we are in comparison with the other partners in BRICS? And indeed, we became part of it. And I think part of that history is what brings us together here. But let me also hint that in terms of the program that we want to look at and the questions that we need to answer here, let's also move from the reality of what BRICS represents, how BRICS has been measured in relation to peace and security in Africa, how it has been judged directly or indirectly, and sometimes people are not coming forward openly and bluntly to refer to a particular development around Libya, let me put it point bluntly. Because that was, I think, for me, the litmus test of what will enable us to make a clear determination as to what we are talking about today in terms of the BRICS with peace and security in Africa. Because in that Security Council meeting which adopted Resolution 1973, all the BRICS countries were present, all of them, including Germany. And a lot of people forget this, conveniently or otherwise. In 3 African countries, together with the others that they elected members. But only 1 country is being remembered, and unfortunately characterized as having sold out Gaddafi. Something that we'll have to correct at some time. But I'm just mentioning this at this particular point, that all BRICS countries were part of that Security Council. And I'm not mentioning it for the sake of the record, but because it tells us what the challenge is going to be if we are going to start looking at BRICS also dealing with this important question of peace and security in Africa as a collective, because we've got 2 members of the Security Council who are part of BRICS, permanent members. And their record and the role in the Security Council is known, and the dynamics of the Security Council, I think, is understood by all of us. P3 versus P2. Sometimes today the configuration gets a little bit confused. Because it's P2 plus 1, which depending on circumstances leans together with the previous P3 because of Brexit. The UK sometimes want to stand alone because they can't go as part of the usual package that was there in the past with as part of the EU. Of course, they've got their own relationship that they've revived with the US, which is another dimension of the dynamics that are happening within the Security Council. But what defines the positions that countries take in the Security Council is a national interest. Is a national interest, and that's what informed the abstention of the BRICS countries, except South Africa, in that resolution 1973. Because all of them had nationals on the ground who were working on different projects. And to take a decision under the circumstances that were taking place in Libya at the time, caution became the first consideration. How you voted or how you would vote will determine how the situation will unfold, because it was a touch and go situation. A lot of games being played, because some people went into that meeting with particular intentions. Those particular intentions were not realized in the Security Council itself, but were announced in Paris afterwards, because there was a resolution and an attended phrase that was attached to it, by all means necessary. That's what justified what was the initial intention of other countries, the picture of what they actually wanted to do. Regime change through violent means by removing Gaddafi. That was their aim. That's what they announced in Paris. So it's no more a question of secret as to who was up to what. The question of whether NATO was involved or not, we can still get into it at another stage and debate it. And when they talk about external factors, whether this was a smokescreen or reality. Because there are many things that you still need to unpack, rather than the sensational approach of trying to deal about how Gaddafi was removed and who was responsible. I'm saying this because I'm trying to underline the point that once whatever we wish for BRICS, we must take that experience into consideration. That is one. Two, we must also take the experience of IPSA, how China, South Africa, Brazil, and India acted together on some of these issues. That there is a basis and a precedent in terms of a collective response that can be built upon to inform how we move forward in terms of what we did in Palestine with the IPSA fund and also for Guinea-Bissau, working collectively also with ECOSOC and the UN to deal with the situation in Guinea-Bissau. So there has been an experience, but it has to be broadened. We've got new dynamics now that we have to look at. With what is happening in Niger and what has happened in some of the countries that had undergone coups recently, there is a new element that has come in, and that is Wagner. Whether we like it or not, whether we want to pretend it doesn't exist, is a threat or no threat, it's a reality. We have to reflect on it, we have to think of it, because there is a calculated response to the relationship that has emerged between Wagner and some of those country governments or regimes that emerge out of these unconstitutional processes of taking over, these military regimes, and the excitement of the populations there. I mean, I was looking at the program last night, a tailor in Niger who's doing very well because what he's focusing on is producing Russian flags, because that's what people want, so that they can demonstrate in the street that to hell with France. Sorry for the language, but I'm told it's French. So this is the mood that we are entering into, and you can see it arising, and there's a response to it, and we are part of it. But we have to be very much alert to these things, because what this development, and particularly what we thought we dealt with in 1999, and subsequently by dealing with the issue of unconstitutional takeover of power, it's assuming a different dimension altogether. And what is happening and the response of ECOWAS this time, and the response of the religious and traditional leaders to the decisions of ECOWAS on how to respond to what would have thought to be a popular thing because of what happened in Gambia. The time of what happened in Gambia does not exist today. Those conditions do not exist today. Niger is not Gambia. Niger represents something else. And there are a number of questions about Niger that we still have to ask ourselves. Why is there so much interest in Niger in the manner in which it is happening? By the US. They've never jumped like this in any other situation before. You want me to stop right there? Right, and the others, and let me leave it up to him, because I think I'm intruding into his trend of management of the situation. Thanks for holding me, because I was going to go on for the next 2 weeks.
Ambassador Nhlapo, one of the interesting aspects of your train of thought is that your wealth of knowledge is incredible. And for an underling like me to interrupt such a narrative is borderline embarrassing. But what I'm trying to do here is to bring the audience, or draw the audience into a controlled narrative about the conversation we want to have. That being context, and you've just provided incredible context to this conversation. But I want to generalize it a little more so that the audience understands the value of the context, or at least the importance of the context that you've just shared with us. The general nature of conflict around or across Africa has changed greatly over the past 100 years, from a colonial struggle to a so-called independence struggle to organize the nation state, to the challenges faced by the nation states building themselves, or at least the governments organizing themselves, to the conflicts, the micro conflicts that slowly become larger conflicts around governance, around resource sovereignty, and around resource protection. And these conflicts have diversified, of course, in the Northern Africa, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, and Southern Africa, exhibited different types of conflicts. And you grew up in an era in which Southern African struggle was a reality for most of us in this room, and the younger generation wouldn't quite understand the gravity, or at least how much it had changed your lives. But the Southern African struggle, for example, is something I want to pick on, and how it impacted cooperation, how it impacted conflict management, how it impacted the conflict landscape, not just Southern Africa, but brought the got global players or external actors involved. And this is, again, also obviously across Africa, how these external actors involved themselves in these struggles. This is what I want to contextualize, so that we all then begin to see the changing landscape or theater of conflict across Africa in a historical perspective. In your perspective, in your understanding, how has that changed from independent struggles, from struggles against structural adjustment, and how external actors became increasingly involved, intimately involved in our development landscape, and how that created more, or dare I say, more reasons for conflict. And the bogey in the room, religion and conflict, Islam and conflict, or Arabization and conflict. What are these, how are these factors changing the dynamic across the African landscape? So resources, governance, and external actors in all of this. Looking at it from from the past, if I make myself clear.
No, thank you very much for that interruption and bringing back in the manner in which we are doing. Because it will still be a continuation and consistent with what I was trying to underline, but precisely in what you are saying. You know, one of the things about anti-colonial struggles that we always have to remember is that it produced a number of things in terms of the thinking of Africans, in terms of how Africans acted together, Pan-Africanism, how it emerged, and Pan-African solidarity, amongst other things. But in the context of the struggle in Southern Africa, there is also another element of international solidarity that became a feature. And it was precisely within the context of the Cold War. It was not something that was by easy choice and an easy way out, or because it was a nice thing to do. It was a response to certain realities because of how the Cold War impacted on Africa's development, post-African independence. And therefore, the challenges that the continent faced during that period, and if you look at the post-independence, and the role of the former colonial powers in terms of how they continue to want to have control over the politics and the resources of the continent. It became a great feature of post-independence Africa and played itself even more sharper in the context of the Cold War. And Africa became the biggest loser, by the way, and the theater of that Cold War. So you can't forget that. And we have, in whatever thinking, in terms of our future, we have to be informed by that experience, because it's going to define who we are, where do we belong, and how we begin to respond to the challenges that we faced. 1990 came. And before that, of course, what is normally called the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the end of the Community of Socialist States as we knew it at the time, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a response from the African continent, which sometimes we forget. 1990, the summit of the OAU, where stock was taking on the developments that were taking place in the world and how Africa responded. And new elements were introduced in the approach of Africa to this so-called new world order that emerged. And that began to define what institutions the continent is going to put in place in order to respond. But there are certain issues that have to be looked at. New concepts were emerging. Multi-party democracy. What does it mean for Africa? You had one-party states, one military dictatorships. I mean, the continent was in a mess. How do you fit into this new world order that is making certain prescriptions that these are going to be the dominant features? Africa had to adjust. Question of human rights in the context of where Africa stood. Issues of government, African states and constitutions, all those issues came into question. And the institutions that evolved. The conflicts that were taking place interstate because, again, thanks to the Berlin Conference, we have to be confronted to certain challenges. And the measures we put in place to mitigate that, having accepted the borders that we had, that defend the nation states that we became at independence. Positions had to be changed, but the new development changed the landscape altogether. Intra-state conflicts became much more sharper and prominent, and we needed institutions on the continent to respond to that. How do we respond to these new challenges and development? Peace and security architecture of the AU started developing from that. Some 1993 in particular and onwards, we begin to look at how do we really deal with these realities. And thanks to the leadership of the continent, given what it looked like, a real mixed masala of military dictatorships, emerging countries that just won their anti-colonial struggles through armed struggle, and other changes that were taking place in different ways, the disintegration of one-party states into something that was unimaginable, many-party states, which were multi-party called. There was a lot of confusion, still reigns. And the continent had to try and respond. But that leadership, given the mixed masala it was able to respond appropriately for different reasons. To have an architecture that will be appropriate to respond to the challenges that we face. And the transformation of the OAU to AU was part of the product of that and the defining movement of how Africa was beginning to reshape and the institutions that emerge out of that in order to deal with these challenges. Your NEPAD, your, I mean, all those institutions that we know today that emerged. That was in response to the changing landscape, which were determined largely from outside the continent. And we were saying at the time that we want to be part of those changes. We want to be part of the processes that are taking place to define how the world we live in change. And that is why Africa had to start taking the positions that it was taking, even in relation to the United Nations, and how the United Nations should change. Of course, we use reform because maybe that's a limited possibility we have, but we need transformation of that institution. I don't know what you reform there. I'm still trying to understand, having worked there. Sometimes this thing of reform gives me nightmare.
Thank you. In fact, that small caveat about the need for reform and the skewing of this concept, or at least the understanding of just the nature of what needs to be reformed, is a question we need to answer. It sort of leads me to the next question. And I mean, looking at how we are now beginning to understand the impact of conflict management and the practitioners involved, including yourself, how it's coped with the complexity over the past 20, 30 years. What is your understanding of this ability to cope with these changing conflict environments, be it the Great Lakes region, be it West Africa right now, and even Southern Africa, Mozambique, for example. And sorry, before I alluded to the growing challenge of religion. I mean, it's not just Islam, it's Christianity, and just generally how religion has an influence on governance and how this impacts stability across Africa. How have you been able to navigate these landscapes? How have conflict management practitioners, or dare I say mediation practices, managed to adapt to these changing environments?
One of the sins that Boutros Ghali committed was to come with an agenda for peace and an agenda for development, which began to challenge the status quo. And it became an undesirable Secretary General of the United Nations. And, it had to be made sure that it doesn't get his second term, because he was beginning to come up with a position that was redefining his office, what the good offices of a Secretary General means, rather to being a prisoner of the Security Council and a friend of the General Assembly. And I'm making those decisions because those organs of the UN determine what happens to this institution that was established, as this charter says, we the people of the United Nations, and the people disappeared in the process. So the charter is no more we the people of the United Nations, it has become something else. We the governments of the P5 or P3 or P1. Dynamics have changed. And therefore, in that particular context, when he started introducing this issue, there were other things that were coming up, new economic international order. There was a challenge to the status quo. Developing countries were also responding, organizing themselves. G77 emerged in that process within the UN, and then you had also the non-aligned movement. And this was a way of beginning to address the multilateral order that was with all the rules that govern the behavior of nations and nation states, to ensure that the peace that we are all yearning for, and ensuring that not another war would visit humanity, is something that becomes a reality. And within these institutions, we can be able to define and develop rules that can take us somewhere. We are still in a situation where we are trying to deal with that. It's getting even worse, and disarmament on a number of areas where we thought we were making progress, but there was a pushback. And because the struggles continues, and the responses, organized responses to some of these challenges that have been even accelerated by unipolarity, and the manner in which decisions were imposed when it came to a number of issues in terms of how we deal with peace, security, and stability, and even the question of avoiding any other war because of the measures that have been taken into place. So I'm saying that that is the reality that defined how practitioners also began to respond, because these were the prescriptions in a way, and these were the possibilities that were open in order to engage in those processes, and particularly non-state actors and civil society organizations having to enter into this intergovernmental, multilateral sphere where everything was being determined. You had this development that was coming up, which was beginning to shape things, where non-actors were beginning to more and more take up the challenge of wanting to deal with the weaknesses that are there, but also to make sure that things happen in a manner in which helps. Now, a lot of challenges started happening. You're mentioning religion and all these other things. I mean, 9/11 changed the whole thing. And it was not before that. You know that Afghanistan, if you look at the history of that country, that is the country that gave us the Mujahideens. And 9/11 is a product of what happened in Afghanistan after what was called the Soviet invasion and what happened afterwards. And the whole history preceding that was still reaping the effects of that, but with different variations. 9/11 introduced something. You create a monster which you can't handle, and then you have to deal with it. Your Mujahideens, your Bin Laden, and then 9/11 happens, and then war and terror. So everything changes. It changes how we deal with peace and security on the continent based on what is now sometimes being defined as a vital interest of one single country because of its mistakes.
You're beginning to connect the dots. In fact, that's what I want our audience to understand, how this, or how peace and security relates in Africa, relates to peace and security engagement across the planet. Moreover, I think another question begins to raise its head: leverage. Leverage as a practitioner, as a manager in these conflict environments and spaces. What kind of leverage do we have? What kind of leverage does an African mediator going into theaters of conflict have? Whether it be Libya, whether going into the international stage in Ukraine, or even a looming issue between the West and East in terms of China and the US in the Pacific, what kind of leverage do we have as mediators? How have we updated these techniques so that we are able, or at least strategies, so that we're able to confront these issues constructively? Leverage, this is an important question. What leverage do you have now that we're beginning to understand how external actors are shifting the goalposts, so to speak? As you alluded to, new economic world order and so on. You know, what kind of leverage do we have, given that a lot of African states are in serious amounts of debt, or at least comparatively small amounts of debt, but for African governments, unsustainable amounts of debt, resources are depleting, and state infrastructure is falling apart. So what leverage do we have? What leverage do you bring to a table as a conflict management practitioner and mediator?
I think it's legitimacy born out of a desire to see justice. That becomes a leverage, because that is what drives you to believe that things have to be done, and believe in the people claiming their right to determine their future. In whatever difficult circumstances in which they find themselves, and what drive the conflicts in which they get engulfed. What are the drivers? What are the conditions that lead to these conflicts? You have to take a look into all of those things and be able to say, where is the space? What happens? What are the interests of those who want to sustain the status quo? And what are the challenges of those who want to bring about change? What is possible? What are the tools that are available to navigate this difficult terrain of having to deal with interests? Well, that's a very, very, very difficult issue to navigate. And sometimes deal with the very people who are driven by their interest to take certain actions. Sometimes people think they have a leverage to manage a particular conflict or to even mediate. I'm sure today, if you ask the Saudis and the Americans about Sudan and what leverage means in a situation like that one, they wouldn't want to talk about it. So leverage has become something that is elusive, because there are certain realities that will determine what is the leverage that you have. France, in terms of how it relates and related to and controlled its former colonies, thought that the 50-year agreement that they signed at independence was a leverage to continue to have control over them. And when that 50 years ended, everything started to unravel. Some of the countries are dealing with that reality now, in a different way, unfortunately. When they're saying no more, you can't have everything that is yours controlled somewhere else. Somebody's got you don't even know what you are worth because somebody's sitting on it. Simply because of the advantage they had in Berlin, and they were giving your country as their sphere of interest, and therefore they decided to turn it into their own provinces, as they would call sometimes our country. So these are the dynamics that we have to deal with. Some people think they have the leverage because of that history. That's why you have pen holders in the Security Council. Because they think by being former colonials and present, as permanent members of the Security Council and becoming pen holders, they will determine how the UN responds to any conflict on the continent. They think that's leverage, and this is what is being challenged. So, non-state actors who organize themselves and enter into this sphere, like Accord had been doing, you straddle a very difficult situation. One, because of resources, but at the same time, you have to be principled. I believe I need to do this. I can do it. The parties in conflict are confident that I can be a partner in walking this path with them to find a solution. And you have an interest, and in fact, you are part of the partly responsible for the situation in which we find ourselves. And you say you want to lend a hand. It must be unconditional. You can't say do it this way as you would do with the AU and say we'll give you money, and the money we give you, it will go to that situation. You are not contributing to the peace fund and say deal with the challenges that you see. You determine where that money should go. And the same thing happens with non-state actors or think tanks or outfits like Accord. We have to deal with that thing. We have to stand on your feet and say, only on this basis, and if you want me to do it your own way, you can have your money. I'm an African, this is an African situation. These are the challenges that we are faced with. We want to deal with this institution. There is a possibility that you can move. And then the question of partnership, you say you want to partner with us. It must be on our terms. The only leverage you have there is your integrity and also your legitimacy to those that you or who have invited you or you have had the honor and privilege to manage their conflict together with them as a partner, genuine partner with no any other interest but justice, peace, and stability.
And in fact, that's why I asked the question leverage, because it's a key element of the conflict management space, within the conflict management space, the ability for the mediator to establish independence or separate themselves from the conflict, but at the same time ensure that there is direction in bringing about some kind of consensus. But given that issue, I mean, I think you've raised it on numerous occasions that this is only going to intensify the interests involved from external actors is only going to intensify due to the growing caution around resources, around protecting state resources. We know China engaged in some sort of moratorium on mining over a decade ago. We know the US put a hold on IP distribution or its ability, high technology and the sharing of information in that regard, shut down, and in fact that's how they've engaged in economic sanctions as a result. How are we then going to adapt to this as African states and governments and non-state actors? How are we going to appreciate the power this has over our ability to manage our conflicts, so to speak, in interests, national interests? We know there's a lot of uranium in Niger. We know there's a lot of gold in the area. We know that because of the conflict between East and West regarding the monetary system, regarding the currency issues, this is going to impact our ability to generate revenue and to generate capital so that we can develop our resources, so to speak. So external actors have increased interest in our space, and how are we going to navigate that in the next 20 to 50 years as African states and societies, and specifically as mediators and conflict management practitioners?
You have mentioned uranium in Niger. And French reliance on it. You didn't mention that, but that's part of the connection and the need to keep a hold on uranium so that their energy situation is sustainable. It's for their own interests, it's for their own development. That is, it's nothing to do with Niger. But we also know that there are drones stationed in Niger. The only country where there has been an admission during the Obama administration that a lot of drones were deployed there. Maybe that's why the owners have been rushing to try and assess what would happen with the custodian of those drones, if one would want to be cynical about the difficult situation. When Gaddafi was overthrown, thanks to modern technology, CNN and the others, they showed us massive arms that moved from Libya to Niger. What happened to them? Where are those arms today? Who's looking after them and why? They went in, but nobody has given us any account of what happens to those weapons, massive weapons. We've seen them on our TVs, with the humiliation of Gaddafi and everything happening. At the same time, you saw massive weapons that were moving into Niger. And an injection of more foreign troops coming into the play because of the conflict that was taking place in Niger, which is again defined what happened in the Sahel region, and a lot of it is to do with what happened in Libya and the after effects of that. Whether people want to accept or deny it is part of the fact that we have to keep on investigating further and asking the questions why and what happened. And not just limit ourselves to certain questions that we have been conditioned to only ask and think about, but go beyond that. Niger has raised a number of other issues. I mean, for the first time, you have had coups taking place, even the recent ones. You have never seen solidarity between those who had been placed under sanctions, or ECOWAS has to respond to those developments in different ways or even uneven ways. What happened in Chad, what happened to different conflicts, what happened to Mali, the way they were managed. There were different approaches and different ways of trying to deal with them. Now, all of those were placed under sanctions who came through the same way. I saying touch them, you're touching us, we're going in. And you're saying that your own organization, we want to get rid of this enslavement by France and others. We want to take control of our own situation We want to manage our security. We want to develop our own capacity to defend our people and defend ourselves because of this onslaught that we are faced with. You are saying you want to come in. You take over our responsibility. You make us look ridiculous in the eyes of our own people. We move around in uniform, but you are not contributing anything towards a peace or protecting or defending our people, because you, the guardian, together with your other friends who've got other interests which we don't understand, have decided to take over our responsibility. You humiliate military people in that way and reduce them into nothing. That's what you will get. It's part of that response that we want to take our own responsibility. And if you have our elected governments are going not to give us the capacity as the constitutionally mandated institution of the country to defend the sovereignty of the country, and you are going to rely on people who are not sure whether they've got our interest at heart, we'll take the situation into our own hands. It's an unfortunate development. But it's governance issues. It's got a lot of other dynamics that we have to still look into them. It is beginning to put to test our own peace and security architecture. All the layers that we have put in place, be it the panel of the wise, be it whatever the cooperation and partnership with NGOs, in an endeavor to deal with all these things. The whole panel of the wise, as I've said, you've got firm-wise, now you've got the youth coming into the whole mix. There's a whole architecture developing. But you can't marshal that to have an appropriate response. When the first three started, all the institutions of the AU converged in Ghana, including with the NGOs and everybody, looked at this thing. How do we respond to this? Came up with proposals to a conference took place in Malabo, came and defined how we move forward given the new developments and the situation that has emerged. The human rights, human and people's rights, that in convened looked at the aspects that has an impact on human and people. The institutional capacity of the AU was brought into action. To respond to these challenges, we have the proposals, they are on the table. Now the question is, how do we move? As the late President Mugabe would put it, may his soul rest in peace, how do you make sure that you can have peace and security with European money? Why not your own resources? That question was brought about when there was a process of reform of the AU. How do we resource our own institutions? Then it brings about a lot of other questions. That's why we have to look at how do we make sure that the institutional capacity of the AU is brought together to act in uniform. What has started in Durban 2 years ago by a common meeting in the Peace and Security Council together with the APRM to look at how to cooperate. APRM does its own, and it's a voluntary process. It deals with the governance issues. We know the challenges that emerge out of that voluntary engagement, and the challenges, it's a perfect early warning system. How does that feed into the Peace and Security Council of the AU? How do they then have a response that is appropriate to the challenges that have come through to our own institutions? How do you deal with the structural challenges that are identified in the process? How do you make the NEPAD development agency relevant? How do you knit together the peace, security, stability, and development nexus into a formidable cooperation of these three main institutions, and together with the other newborn baby that we celebrate every time in isolation, you can't have an intercontinental trade agreement outside of the integration of the continent with your primary institution that is supposed to make sure that this harmonization of legislation in order to ensure integration of the continent, and that is the Pan-African Parliament. Let's respect our institutions, make them work, and make sure that we can then begin to deal effectively with our challenges.
Ambassador Hlapho, that's what I wanted to steer the conversation to an ending that is appropriate for the questions you've raised, which is quite a number of challenges and therefore questions, and how we engage those challenges. And you've just begun to allude at a key element of that being a sort of Pan-African approach to integration of our institutions and forms of governance. In fact, that's where we will sort of begin to wrap up our conversation, looking at a post-conflict and reconstruction outlook or development outlook across the conflict theaters we have on the continent. And what key areas to focus on, especially that one, women are at the center, have an intimate connection with the types of conflict we have, the violence that is meted on communities, that they are the forefront, they are the ones that face the largest amount of pressure to sustain their livelihoods in communities. One, two, how the youth then are plugged into this post-conflict scenarios, and how we engage them more seriously and pragmatically in these future forms of conflict management. But most importantly, how you see this so-called integration panning out, and what sort of mindset do state actors and non-state actors need to have? What kind of mindset they should take on board strategically to begin to actualize this reality? That's a way of wrapping up a huge topic and a huge theme, but at the same time looking ahead, given our experience and our sense, a strategic sense of direction.
You know, this continent has traveled a long way, and has used the brain power that it has and institutional capacity to define and enrich Pan-African responses to the challenges that we have. I'm saying Pan-African responses to the challenges that we have, not the popular phrase which I won't go into now. African solutions to African problems. Sometimes problems which have got nothing to do with Africans, except that they happen on the continent. So I sometimes have a problem with that one, but I'm not going, that's my personal weakness. Let's maybe look at it from that way. But the Abuja Treaty and the Lagos Plan of Action introduced very interesting principles and institutional capacity that needed to be built to ensure the integration of the continent. And one of those what were then defined as the building blocks of integration on the continent. And those were the regional economic communities. Now, if you look at what has happened into them, beginning with COMESA, which was the first test case, it moved out into something else. Its sub-regional dimension fizzled out. maybe because of interest that was broader in terms of how it started. Then you had SADC, which emerged under completely different circumstances, but in line and fitted into that. And then you had ECOWAS, which also emerged on its own, ECAS and the rest, not according to the blueprint. The institutions of the AU or the structures of the AU, organizational structures of the AU, you've got 5 regions. And those 5 regions were supposed to blend with these regional economic communities in order to ensure the building blocks towards what already, as it was progressing, became established in 1993. And that is the African Economic Community. A lot of people have forgotten or even don't even know that it exists. Signed and ratified. There is an African Economic Community which met 93, 94, 95, 96, up to 99, afterward the AU and other institutions emerged somehow as we were moving along, and with the many challenges that we started having, and the many regional or formations that came about in response to certain historical and geographical developments. This whole concept of regional economic communities also took a different format altogether. You had emerging something called IGAD, of an institution that was developed to deal with desertification and drought. It was about climate change, but it became something else. So it transformed. And you have to look at all of those things. The East African community was reborn. For the 3rd time, I think now it exists. Hopefully it will last. And then we've got all the mix. We need to really look at how we are organized as a continent and how we respond. You see, otherwise we're going to find ourselves having serious challenges. What is happening to ECOWAS today with the developments in Niger? If we are not careful, we are going to have, for a problem that has been created outside of this continent, ECOWAS armies fighting a war that is unnecessary. If things go in the manner in which we have been behaving up to now. Luckily, you've got your religious and indigenous leadership that remembered history and say, hey, wait, you can't be doing these silly things. You're saying you want to declare war against, no, wait. What is the problem we're trying to solve here? Can't we find a way of engagement and find a solution to deal with this problem? Once in Ghana, the government is being told, we are not going to have a meeting here in order to decide on invading the house as our cousins. That we are not going to allow as the traditional rulers of this country. That meeting is not going to take place. What does that mean? A lot of things are being redefined, and all of those things, we have to take them into consideration. When those religious leaders in Nigeria are beginning to say, we are not going to do the silly thing that you think you are going to do, you as this government. It's not going to happen. We are going to go there and talk to those guys and the religious leaders here and try to understand what is the problem, how we can solve it. We should also begin to remind ourselves and recall that we do have our indigenous ways of dealing with managing conflicts. They are bringing themselves up now through. You can talk about, which is another thing that we have to look at. You talk about standby force. It's an intervention force that you're trying to put together. It's a standby force. In terms of the standby force, as per agreement of the AU and what should have been happening in regions, does not exist. SAMIM is not a standby force in Mozambique. It's a coalition of forces from few countries that have been willing to take the risk to go into the fray. So let's rebuild our institutions that will respond appropriately to the new dimensions of challenges and conflict that we're faced with. And I think, given the political will, and all of us putting the shoulder to the wheel and saying, as academic institutions, for instance, we think it's about time you consult us. You can produce knowledge that can begin to inform your political decisions that affect us. We are your institutions, created by you, included in your budgets from our money. But you ignore us when it comes to using the brain power that can be used. And then you are going to depend on external forces to bring young people who are going to do research and head the processes of developing knowledge and solutions to our challenges. I think we as Africans must come to a point, and here, talking to academics, I wish I was one, I would say let us take our place, and everybody else, civil society. We can't be talking about civil society having to come to the fray, and everything else. Let the people of the United Nations prevail.
Ambassador Nhlapho, you have aptly concluded this conversation. I mean, you've opened other questions, I mean, regarding, I won't say indigenous, but self-serving methods and ways to deal with conflict across the African continent. I think that's a very important avenue of thought that we need to look to engaging further in the future. One, two, ownership of our, dare I say, leverage, of ownership of our ability to resolve these crises that have been brought upon us, but to also bring the necessary partnership from the global order relevant to our management of conflict across the continent. I think you've aptly once again summarized that. In fact, it's on that note, colleagues, that I want to halt this dialogue temporarily. I think I'm going to give us about a 10-minute break so that we can refresh our minds and prepare ourselves for the questions that we want to pose to Ambassador Nhlapho regarding what has just been discussed. But before we do that, let's please give Ambassador Nhlapho a warm round of applause. Thank you, thank you. Let's try and take a 10-minute break and be as accurate as possible for the Q&A that's to follow. Thanks, colleagues. Yeah. Colleagues, welcome again. Apologies, I had to increase the time for the break because it seemed, I think, most of us needed to digest the information and food in the time and in the break. But that now that we have had sufficient time to recuperate, I think I'm expecting fantastic questions from the audience and the online audience that we have today. I'm not going to dare try and summarize the past proceedings because of just how in-depth and how varied the answers were. However, I'm going to limit the amount of questions that are going to be posed to our esteemed guest, Mbasa Ntlapo, to 2 questions at a time from whoever wishes to pose them. And secondly, and I will insist, I will be uncompromisingly blunt if you're not posing a question, but rather making a comment. This is a Q&A, so I'd prefer that I will insist that everyone or anyone who wishes to ask questions, make sure your question is tight, short, and to the point. I think that would summarize my desire for the Q&A. And also, I've limited to 2 because Ambassador Ntlapo needs to write down these questions, and he's aging, so his ability to write all the time might be compromised. So again, let's keep it short and to the point. Okay. Sorry. Sorry? Oh, moving the mic around. Right. Okay. So let me hand over the mic to one of our assistants.
Thank you very much. I'm Jean-Jacques Cornish, and I'm not used to singing for my supper, but I will mumble for my muffin this morning. Ambassador Ntlapo, we were both in Durban in 2002 when the African Union was set up, with very high, lofty expectations. Chiefly among those was that it would no longer be a comfortable club, a comfortable talk shop for African affairs, and that it would call out those African leaders who were deficient in human rights and who committed war crimes and that sort of thing. It was to be a muscular body that would regulate what was happening in Africa. Do you think in the course of events that it has met those expectations? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. You mentioned of the kind of integration, if you like, that Africa needs in order to respond to interest, like the external national interest in African peace and security environment, and some of those interests you really spoke very well about. Now my question is on how you see the BRICS, South Africa being a key player in the BRICS, how you see that participation supporting the role it's playing in actually supporting the kind of integration that Africa needs to respond to foreign interest in the African peace and security environment. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. I'm going to, sorry, before I hand over the platform, to insist that you introduce yourselves before you pose your questions, so that the audience, online audience and audience present familiarize themselves with who you are. But thank you. Ambassador Ntapo, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Indeed, there were high expectations that things would change. In 1999, at the summit of the OAU in Algiers, in the segment that was dealing with peace and security, as I was saying, that the OAU at the time was meeting as in two parts: peace and security segment to deal with the challenges of peace and security on the continent, and then as the African Economic Community to deal with challenges of integration. In the debate that ensued on the peace and security issues, one contribution went beyond that. Muammar Gaddafi took the floor. Of course, he spoke until he was satisfied and said what he wanted to say. He didn't bother about the time limitations, whatever. He just spoke from the heart. And the question he was raising, that from the discussions that have been taking place and everything that has been happening, there had been a Pan-African vision that was propounded by Nkrumah of the nature of the unity of the continent that we seem to be avoiding and busy talking about many other things and not the cardinal issue. So what do we do? Because it is quite clear that as heads of states you have got limitations. I'm a leader, you are heads of state, so I'm different from you. You've got limitations because on how you got elected, how you conduct your politics, and therefore I am saying let's go back to the vision of Nkrumah. Let's begin to talk about an African government and an African army. And he said, I've got the building, I've got everything in Sirte, I can accommodate you if that is your problem as to where you want to go. It was very clear, he threw that challenge. But of course, when he threw that challenge and the manner in which he did it, there was a response because people were not expecting a discussion that will go in that direction. And yet actually made an offer and he said he's prepared to convene the first meeting in Sirte so that these issues can be debated if that is not the forum. As it was cautioned that it is not possible to exhaust the questions that is posing because they're very pertinent. And that's where the discussion and the debate started. And indeed, as promised, he went ahead and convened that meeting at Sirte. But first with academics that he put together, called together, and asked them to prepare documents, which were then presented to the ministers of foreign affairs to be looked at and be subjected to be presented to a conference where the Sirte Declaration was adopted, that he had proposed that should take place. And those were the processes arising from those documents, and his own perspective and thinking emerged the Constitutive Act as part of the Sirte Declaration, the outlines of what should constitute the transformation of the AU into what is practical and achievable, rather than thinking of forming an African government or having an African army, so that the aspirations of Kwame Nkrumah can be met. And that was Gaddafi. That was his own way of approaching things. That's when the debate started. And since then, it went on until the summit in Zambia, where the debate started on what kinds of institutions do we need for this African Union that we're talking about. If we want to transform, what is it that we have? What is it that we need to change? Of course, a peace and security architecture as it existed at the time was one of those that had to be looked at. And out of it emerged the Peace and Security Council, which is what the Durban decided. Of course, NEPAD was still called then something else. It was still in the concept that was evolving, particularly discussions between President Bouteflika Mbeki and Obasanjo, to look at how the continent gets integrated into the global economy. That was the initial discussion and debate about NEPAD. How do we get integrated in this global economy, and how are we going to deal with it? And that's why it created a misunderstanding in the beginning, because the first thing was to go, after there was an agreement on the concept, for a delegation to go to a meeting of the G8 and make a presentation there that you can't be sitting here and talking about the global economy without us. We have ideas, this is what we want. And some people say, hey, this NEPAD, what is it now? Is it something to, why do you want to talk to those people? So there's a bit of confusion in the beginning. And then, of course, Abdul Wade then joined in and said, no, I want to come in. I've been thinking about a project on infrastructure. We need to focus on infrastructure. So it became part of the three. And then it expanded, and that's how NEPAD, first it was a new initiative for Africa. New African Initiative, it was called. And of course, at that time, the only two countries would respond to that acronym as were being pronounced, and it was only South Africans and the Namibians, because it was the chairperson rightly called it NAI because it's an acronym, and NAI in Afrikaans means something else. So people wanted to understand what is this thing that is tickling the South Africans and the Namibians. And when somebody explained, said, no, man, let's think of something else. This is going to create problems for us. But let's look at it in a different way. It started on a lighter note, but it was developing in the end into what became NEPAD. And then the other ideas about what should be new in this union, distinct from the way we've been doing things. What are the kinds of institutions that will define this African Union? Not exactly as a brother leader was proposing, but to make sure that taking into account the concerns that he was raising, that we can then build the kind of institutions that will enable us to respond to these developments. And then in Maputo, it was then confirmed some of those things, further developments, until a decision was taken, no, let's launch South Africa, can you host? And that's how it came about. And all of those issues were then tabled in South Africa. But the discussions have been ongoing, even about the Pan-African Parliament. So those debates, all of them, so it was a question of how do you fit them to be in line with the Constitutive Act? Because the key element that was being addressed was the question of how do we move away from this issue of hiding behind sovereignty. Everything, no, we're sovereign states. So we can't move if we're going to hide behind this. You kill people and say we're a sovereign state. You have elections, you don't want anybody, there's a sovereign act. And all this thing about election observation and everything only started afterwards, when this issue of sovereignty was agreed upon and the element of non-indifference came in. That no, you can't lock your country and kill people and say that it's a sovereign decision as a state, non-interference in the affairs of other states must apply. So that was a very systemic shift to an extent that even the UN and some people in the UN were surprised that these Africans are going really beyond what the UN is prepared to do, except the limited window that is provided by Chapter 7 with very serious considerations of peace enforcement. So all of these things were also to deal with these unconstitutional changes of government, so to have the institutional capacity, but that the union must decide. If a member defaults, we must punish. We must impose sanctions, don't wait for others to do it. We should, on our own, determine how do we make sure that we correct anything that goes wrong. And indeed, it started from there. But it has always been difficult. I think today, even the issue of sovereignty still becomes a different problem. You can't just take a decision and say you'll go into any country and do whatever. They will tell you, you come here, then you'll meet your match. We're not going to allow you. You still have to negotiate that space. We're not yet there. And even when you talk of integration, we have not been able to move because we have to seize aspects of your sovereignty to the collective so that the community can decide on certain issues in the interest of the whole. So you've got to make those decisions. That's why the Pan-African Parliament became a critical element to harmonize legislation on issues of that nature. Now we're making a circus out of it. We are not really meeting those objectives. That's why we're not moving. And at the end of the day, with all the challenges that I've mentioned, if we don't address the fundamental issue, and if we say we want to build institutions of democracy, and then you play around with elections and call for them even where there are no parties to contest them, and you expect the outcome of whatever comes out of those elections by those what you call parties to contest, with all the flaws, to put in place a democratic parliament and have all the issues that goes with all the things that you expected, or how you behave in a democratic institutions. So you start from, your start becomes a false one. Because the nature of the political parties and why people form political parties is mainly for wrong reasons. People will survive because if I need to have a strong political party, I must rely on my people. And my people is not the nation, is your ethnic group. It's limited. The values, we have values that we've defined, but they don't translate into policies of political parties and institutions that they build. And therefore, countries don't live up to expectations of the constitutive act of the collective approach towards what the Africa we want. 2023, it's about that, not 2023, sorry. Yes, it was, which said, let's define the Africa we want, let's have a vision and deal with these principles and say this is what is going to guide us. Having come out of this experience, and it is work in progress and unfortunately at a very slow pace. That's number one. So not all the expectations have been met, and they'll have to be met because we know the challenges. Now that we have a vision of the Africa we want, let's examine our institutions, where we started, what is it that we had to put these institutions in place, what will they do? If you change NEPAD into what is now, what it is, a development agency, it's work in progress, because you are beginning to address certain issues. If you deal with intra-African trade, even if we're starting on a slow start dealing with technical issues, of make sure that we build an institution that is compliant with WTO standards, how many Africans are going to be able to comply and benefit out of that? We have to ask ourselves that challenge. Are we creating something that we are going to be able to control? So I'm saying, those are the expectations, that's work in progress, that's what we need to do. The second one, on the question of, it depends on us. You can't call upon our partners to support us on some things we are not prepared to do ourselves. If you say the BRICS Bank must support processes on the continent, it can't be a Father Christmas. You can't say there are certain things because the World Bank and the IMF has treated us in this particular way. You, BRICS Bank, as we have been dealing with individual countries, we want you to maintain the same standards and principles. There must be an agreement as to the qualification and what should happen. Otherwise, it will collapse. And the African Development Bank must also begin to fine-tune and prepare itself on how it will work in tandem with the BRICS Bank, taking into consideration that we still have the G20, which is going to be a difficult animal to control after the expansion of BRICS, because some of the countries in the G20 will be in BRICS. What happened in Indonesia will happen 100 times. You might not have a G20 anymore because you won't be able to convene. So South Africa, if you are prepared to convene, this was small, because you have to bring together all the people who don't want to sit together and talk about the common challenges. You might have to address the question, back to the question, whether the G20 should not go back to what it was before 2008, to be just a meeting of ministers of finance and the central banks to look at the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions. That was the initial mandate. But because of the crunch in the US in 2008, George Bush convened a high-level meeting of heads of state And that's how the G20 changed from what it was initially supposed to do. And it created a problem with the UN. They said, hey, some unilateralism emerging. And yes, this thing seems to want to deal with everything that committees of the United Nations General Assembly are dealing with. So there were question marks from the very beginning. And Gordon Brown, the next year, when he called the meeting, it was at that level. The next thing, it was Obama at that level. Now it has become something else. The ministers of finance still meet in between, but we still need to streamline, because otherwise you'll have too many, what we were calling then, minilaterals, dealing with almost the same issues, and your multipolarity might become something else, a different concoction, because it might be defined by this institution where the same thing is discussed in different formations as they develop. Now we don't have a G7, 8 anymore, we've got G7. We don't know whether it will be sustainable. They were trying an attempt to make it G6, something else again. So there are many dynamics and challenges that are going to take place, and we should be ready for it. And our expectations of cooperation of BRICS in a number of areas, including this one, must take those factors into consideration.
I hope that has answered your questions legitimately and thoroughly. I think because we're running out of time, we're just going to request that colleagues ask one question at a time.
And my answer should be short.
And your answer should be short. But there's such informative answers. But yes, if possible, Ambassador Club. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Bao Maohong, an environmental historian from Peking University, China. Is now a visiting professor at UNISA. I'm wondering what's the role of AU in the global environmental governance? What's the role of South Africa in AU's environmental governance program?
Please introduce yourself first.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Lapo, for the insightful presentation. My name is Cecilia Nedziwe. I'm a senior lecturer at Rhodes University in the Department of Political and International Studies. Ambassador, I want to take you back to the question on leverage. What leverage we have, or what leverage there is in the Niger conflict. This is in terms of the strong voice that is coming from the people that they want France out of that region or out of Niger. So given the realities in that country and using leverage, the leverage of what the people want, how can a resolution to this conflict in terms of addressing what the people want look like using the question of leverage?
Yeah, I think Niger is brought about certain realities that we might have been avoiding for some time. You can't have what will normally be standard operation procedures or prescripts on how you respond to conflicts without taking into consideration the complexities and history. And why at that time? And who responds and how? So it has raised those questions because it's not the first recent. Why different with them? This is the question we have to ask ourselves And different questions have emerged, even from within the region, which brings back issues. When people say the Hausas are our cousins, why do you governments want to meet here and take a decision to go invade? What's wrong with you? It's raising a different question altogether. That people still know their history and they understand certain things and the way they should be done. Religious and indigenous leaders are saying, why are you ignoring us when this thing is about us and our people too? We have a responsibility. Why do you take such a reckless decision? You can't do it. It has never been challenged. Now it is being challenged. You have to rethink. As I was saying, that Niger is much more complex than Gambia then, when Yahya Jammeh started getting a little bit naughty. They were easily dealt with him. You could even send a special force platoon from Senegal. They would have neutralized them. They were not in a position to withstand anything at the time. It's different. There's no more the capacity of ECOMOG as at the time of Liberia and Sierra Leone and the circumstances that prevailed. It's different. There's Wagner now, it's a factor, whether psychological or real. In certain cases it's real, in others there's a psychological game that is being played. And it's have the desired impact, you can't ignore it. This is Niger. I've asked certain questions about Niger that we've been avoiding. Let's begin to deal with them. Because one of the things that might re-emerge is CINSAT. CINSAT is that organization that was established by Gaddafi, bringing together some of the countries in that region, Niger being part of it, in the Sahel, including, you see, when this president of Chad took the initiative to go there, you must remember that Chad has always been the key in CINSAT. And Niger hosts the CINSAT Development Bank, in which Gaddafi invested a lot of resources. So there are a lot of stake for many parties. So don't deal with it as a simple thing. Take into consideration those complexities and begin to deal with them in a particular way, but re-examine your peace and security architecture so that don't think about a standby army in order to justify something else. Then you run into problems. I think these are the lessons that you must learn. You must begin to reflect on all of these developments so that you can be able to act appropriately. Now, the first question on governance issues, it's not an easy thing. You know, pardon? On environmental issues. It's not an easy thing. It's all has to do with governance. And some of the challenges on environmental issues have been brought about because of mining, amongst other things. The way concessions have been granted and those companies who are doing mining and what they've left behind, a lot of damage, logging. The forests are being destroyed. You know, for Congo Brazzaville and DRC to go to that meeting in Brazil to discuss about the rainforest because they are also affected, it's a reality. Cameroon, there's nothing left. Maybe that's why they didn't go. But these are all the challenges. These are real issues. You've got migration from the Horn of Africa right up to the Eastern Congo, where people are surviving to live the next day. But people move from there with their cows throughout to want to go and stay. Who would want to go into the Eastern Congo? But it's because of environmental issues which are not properly mitigated. And then you've got all of those challenges that you have to deal with. UNEP is based in Kenya. The primary organization of the UN that has to deal with climate change. How much do Africans really benefit and contribute towards UNEP and have the appropriate responses? We have had, I don't know, COP how many? There's another COP that is coming. Again, decisions. Because of the sanctions that they've imposed on Russia, they are now reverting back to fossil. So climate change is not an issue in Europe. Even some of the coalitions that were based on that will collapse. The green parties might disappear. I don't know what we are going to find in Europe. These right-wing parties coming to the ascendancy and new challenges are all related to climate. So it's an issue. So this issue of mitigation and move away or there are many concepts that have emerged since Denmark. None of them have been realized. None. And the situation is getting worse. Europe is burning. The US is burning. Everybody is saying it's climate change. The kind of winter we're faced with, the type of fires that are blowing everywhere else. Africa is not burning yet in the same way. It's burning in a different way because we've not been polluting to that extent, but we are victims. And there are many other factors that have got to come into play. So it's for us as human beings, humanity, to be able to say, let's continue doing these things, destroy this planet and perish. That's fine if this is a decision I want to take. But if we're going to be taking decisions, let's implement them. And to expect Africa to begin then to change certain things and say, no, you must change, develop policy, you must transition. But leave everything as it is. We still need your resources. We will come and mess around with your environment, but you must transition. So I think these are the challenges that we will continue to be faced with. But where are the appropriate instruments for us to be able to respond effectively as the global community, because we are all in it together. We are going to perish together if you continue in this way.
Thank you. My name is Sipo Mantula from the TM African School. Ambassador Ntapo, there are maybe two issues. I was looking at the National Security Advisors meeting that it was recently held last month. There were two issues that came out. Western nation dominance, cybersecurity. But when I look back at a decade ago, the BRICS eThekwini engagement on peace and security, issues of cybersecurity has been on the agenda. I look at the issues that we have raised, which are sharply to say development cannot be divorced on issues of peace and security. But let me just indulge your mind again, which I know you have been into all these three countries or four, starting with Congo, Kinshasa, DRC. Now I want to link these four countries with the BRICS countries' interest in those countries, because peace and security is also part of development in those countries. DRC Congo, Southern Sudan, Somalia, and the newly to be the chair of the SADC summit now this week, Angola. So when you look at the four countries, all the BRICS countries have an interest in those countries, whether China, Russia, India, or even South Africa. But I'm trying to do what one of the colleagues tried when we were saying finding and funding. So we are finding, we are searching, but also we are funding the Peace and Security Development Corporation in the BRICS countries. So how do we deal with those issues? And I'm a bit worried with our National Security Advisor here. I'm a bit worried about DIRCO, how they deal with issues of peace and security, considering what the Americans have been doing for the past 6 months now. Because the Americanization also and undermining of the BRICS bloc also has a negative impact. You look at the summit that was in Russia, the issues of peace and security was also dealt with. Russia is clear that they want to engage Africa and support African countries on issues of security, intelligence gathering. So those for me are the key issues that even South Africa to understand the present and the future challenges. We can look at the past, but we need to look at the present. What are the dynamics that are facing the BRICS countries, including South Africa and African countries? For us to can forge the future, we need to know the present, where we are. And hence I still want to lambast that the role that we have raised in terms of the REX, the role of the ECOWAS, SADC, and the AU, it has also been the failure of our representative at the UN to say at the UN bloc, when we sit at the UN Security Council, whether as a non-permanent members, what then is our role? When we pay money in the peacekeeping mission funding of the UN, what then is our reason? We are paying money in the UN peacekeeping missions, but what is the return investment for us? So I think I will pause there. You know, Kwesi, the nature of a lawyer and a human rights activist is to always put a point so that Ambassador Tapo can remember some of these 4 countries I've mentioned, but also this latest meeting of the national security advisors of the BRICS countries that have dealt with sensitive issues that are key. Hence I say the Western hegemony, as well as the ICT cyberspace that we are in, that we might be facing in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll have to add. You see, the countries that you've mentioned have got their own history. Very difficult one. Each of them individually. DRC or Zaire, start from there. What became Zaire and what ended up being DRC. It will take you back to Berlin. If you remember that what was called the Berlin Declaration, initially it is also actually been known as the Congo Declaration. It was about the Congo. And the scarving of what emerged as the spheres of interest, it was for everybody else, not only the Congo, but what about the others, where we've got our interests? Can we agree that we carve our spheres of interest, and wherever we are, we don't trample on each other's toes? That's what we're dealing with. DRC is a product of that. What we are looking at the DRC today, be it Inga or anything, Kyung Leopold had long seen it at the time as his private development agent. That here I can develop Belgium if the DRC will serve our interests. He had that vision, but he had to get everybody's cooperation. So he got Germany to convene the conference, which became the Berlin Conference. But it was Belgian Congo. That was Leopold's interest. So we can't forget that history. Somalia is still a contested territory. Somalia, that territory was colonized by the British, the French, and the Italians. Each of them still believe that what is there is part of their colonial heritage. So we've got to contest with that. Again, it's this colonial heritage that we have to contest with. But if you look at Somalia as a state, the voluntary coming together of those countries that got independence from this three to what was called Somalia, with that flag that emerged, which also implicated Ethiopia and Kenya, created a new problem even for Siad Barre. We can't forget that history, how it collapsed, how that process is being managed today. It's a problem for everybody. When the UN tried to do something, the Somalis stood up, they kicked all of them out. When this problem emerged again now, the UN said, were not going because nobody wanted to go to Somalia. Then they created a resolution, that is the Americans, for their own issues, because they are managing their own interagency rivalry in Somalia. And then had to come up with what we now know as AMISOM, as a compromise, and then the AU was handed over this hot potato to deal with no troops, because no troops were prepared to go back to Somalia. Now, we can't forget that history. The complications there today are also the geographic position of Somalia. It's of interest for everybody else from the time of the Cold War. It's coming back to that. If you remember, it's changing hands. Siad Barre gambled with Somalia between Soviet Union and the US, and in the end it collapsed into the civil war that took him out, and the confusion that happened with no central government. And today there's a token of it. It's a problem that we still have to deal with. Many countries are involved. Everybody's got interests. So it means all of us should be able to say, what do we do? If we say as BRICS, what do we do as Somalia? Who's got what interest there? How do we deal with it? The expanded BRICS has got countries that have got more interest in that Horn of Africa, and Somalia is implicated in it as part of that mix. How do they help contribute towards peace in Africa, in the Horn of Africa? With Yemen hopefully being solved, because it became part of the problem of that region. So there are many other dynamics that we have to attend to. So it means, as BRICS should be able, how do we do it? Do you at BRICS, or we influence things differently at the UN? Or we come up with specific projects as we did under IPSA. And to what extent, and define very properly and appropriately, and with all interests declared. There should be no secret or private interests, and it's not going to be easy, because those interests inform the very survival of countries. That might be a difficult thing to do. Let us be looking forward. That's what we'll have to do. Your DRC, your South Sudan, these are all of these countries, including ourselves. We've got bilateral relations and bilateral arrangements, which are driven by our own national interests, but all in the name of peace and security in that thing. And sometimes there's a conflict in our approaches, and things don't blend together because we act within the United Nations with all its challenges and problems, and bilaterally whatever we do and what we do multilaterally in dealing with the collective response to the DRC, and what happens with the Great Lakes countries now that they are coming together. All of these racks that the DRC belongs to, it's part of SADC, appeals to SADC, do something. It's part of the East African community, do something. It's part of ECAS, saying to ECAS, do something. They're part of the ICGLR, saying to everybody must do something. And when everybody tries to do something, no, but we don't trust you, you can't do it. Now they've come together trying to say, look, this thing must come to the end. Can the AU coordinate? Whilst they're doing that, the people on the ground, they say, but the UN must go. We are faced with certain policy dilemmas and choices that will be difficult to make and be able to respond. So we need to look at these things, say, what do we do about the DRC? What has started now, is it sustainable? If so, how do we correct it? How do we correct the mistakes of the past? Who do we tell to get off? But at the end, your problem of sovereignty will come in, because the DRC will still want to exercise the right to have whatever kind of agreements and relations with whosoever. How do you stop it?
Apologies for interrupting, but there was a glaring part, one of his part of his question, which was integral. ICT, cybersecurity. This is the new frontier in terms of interest being exercised from external powers. How are we going to engage that?
No, but yes, there's been an escalation on this front in terms of cybersecurity, which we cannot ignore. And it's part of the geopolitical tensions that are arising and the challenges that will impact on us and have started impacting of us. You see, if we're going to be told by somebody, don't allow Huawei to operate in your country, ban them because there's a security risk for us if they produce or sell their phones in South Africa. I mean, why should somebody who's got a problem with Huawei and whatever technology that they had used to contribute towards the production and the development of the capacity of China, because we're after cheap labor and other things there, all these US companies of Silicon Valley, they're all producing from there. And all of a sudden now there's a problem that these people, they're spying on us. Everything that happens is spying. Germany takes it, no, don't want Chinese students anymore here, not in this area. And if you cooperate with China, we are not going to deal with you. So this is some of the things that we're beginning to be faced with. And people want to test our will on the basis of, if you want to continue with these people, we are going to sort you out. But in his interest. And it's a collective punishment that we now, because of association, we find ourselves in. And it will going to continue. They look for anything else. And the cybersecurity issue is something that we need to deal with it ourselves. Even as a collective, need to cooperate because of this collective punishment that is now meted out. You cooperate with these ones, are going to punish you also. We are being forced by certain reality to move faster on issues that before would touch upon them as themes rather as threats. Now we're identifying a collective threat and we're saying, can we respond? And therefore, let's get the security ministers to deal with these issues, but focus on this one, that we have not collectively reflected on and said, what do we do with it? And this is the evolution of BRICS. There are many areas now that we are going into, which we have not touched before because of the change in the geopolitical tensions and situation. We are preparing ourselves to be able to withstand this challenge as we develop, as we broaden ourselves, and it's going to go bigger. Our problems are going to become bigger with the expansion. It's not that they're going to be easier. We're going to have to manage countries that have never related with each other. But to be able to say what is our common interest, what are the minimum things that we should do together. And people who still want to exercise their sovereign decisions on certain issues. And we have to live with that reality.
Excellent question so
far.
So
the BRICS of other people here in this country, the ones they envisage and the BRICS that they see, they want to see happening, that will collectively boycott this meeting because Putin is not coming. After he took a decision that it's important to manage the war. These are the challenges that we are going to continue to have. And these are the discussions that we ourselves must continue to have, including with the US. Now that we know that this famous lady had carried food to Russia, not arms, as was proclaimed, and we were punished for it, what do we do with that? we have to deal with that with them also, and other pressures and other issues. So that there's nothing that you are going to escape from. You'll have to respond and deal with everything. But how are we organized? That is where we are going to be tested. Statecraft is going to be a major determinant on how we as a country respond and begin to protect ourselves so that we become a worthy partner within the BRICS and not the weakest link.
Do you believe you've sufficiently answered the question?
Well, he's nodding.
He's nodding. Colleagues,
He doesn't do that normally.
we're stretching. He doesn't do that. We're stretching our time, and I have to grant our online audience an opportunity to ask questions. Be it the amount of time we have, I don't think I can field all questions from the sitting audience. And therefore, I encourage that if you do want to pose more questions, that you attend day 2, which will be, which will have a larger group of participants who are able to address your questions. But for now, I'm going to have to encourage those online, whoever is still present, to pose their questions to Ambassador Nhlapo. Now, we'll probably only be able to take 2 questions, one from each participant. So for anyone who's online and wishes to ask a question, now's your opportunity. So I think it's Ambassador Xu Zhan, based in Beijing, China, who is with us. Ambassador Xu, can you hear us? Or are you able to pose your questions? Is your mic set or are you muted? Are you still having the same problems? It seems as though we still have the same problem from the morning. Ambassador Xu, can you hear us? No. Okay. So I think we'll take your question after, and I'll try and field it in tomorrow's session, Ambassador Xu. But everybody, Ambassador Xu Zhan is another distinguished representative from China. More or less in the same standing. I don't want to compare and contrast, but a very distinguished guest as well, who will be speaking in tomorrow's panel. But thank you for being present. I suppose that gives us a small window to take 2 questions from the floor. And I note that our colleague right in front of me and the colleague at that side had their hands up for quite some time. But we'll take more questions tomorrow if possible. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alexis Bukuru. I am the ambassador of Burundi here. I'm sorry that I was late and missed the presentations because of the preparations of the BRICS. But I was very interested in attending this conference on related to peace issues. Ambassador, with your experience, the experience you mentioned and the experience you have not yet mentioned, I would like to ask about this fact of having the conflict relapsing, recurring every time since the establishment of the peace building, since maybe 90s till today. I had the opportunity to read some books, and I noticed that they wrote about root causes, but there are root causes and they cannot have a real medication. Among the root causes, most of scholars mention poverty, but with peacekeeping missions, they have, at my understanding, there is not yet a strategy or a development plan to find a sustainable solution to that. I heard the co-chair there talking about external powers, internal influence. What can you tell about the real external root causes and the internal influence? Because we don't have the peace built sustainably, and what can be the solution for that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Ambassador, my name is Valerie Lowe. I'm from the Department of Public Administration and Management here at UNISA. I just wanted to ask, since the African Union advocates for the meaningful participation of women towards the peace and security agenda in the continent, as well as good governance, democracy, etc., as outlined in the Agenda 2063. I just wanted to ask you your opinion on the role of women in peace and security, or perhaps peace building. And in essence, I'm asking you your opinion on a feminist approach to peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe let me start with that one. You know, it's a question that we've always been raising. In 1996, when the OAU took a decision to create ECOSOC, and there was the debate about the sixth region, which meant the diaspora. And some of the issues that were being looked at is, where do you get and build the capacity to expand the peace and security architecture and the expertise that can be pulled in. What then Salim did in the Conflict Management Center, he then said, as part of the contribution of ECOSOC on peace and security capacity building of that center, for the OAU to be able to respond appropriately, we also need to have a unit of 5 women from each region of the OAU to be consulted and really contribute towards the thinking in terms of how women get involved in peace and security issues. That's when it started. Unfortunately, when the peace and security architecture of the AU developed from the initial stages after the formation of the AU, that element was not institutionalized until the emergence of the FEMWISE, Panel of the Wise, and the women in the Panel of the Wise then started advocating for FEMWISE. They said, no. We need to get a collective of women to also start getting involved practically in doing the work on the ground. Women can't just be a subject of discussion on questions of peace and security, and only be understood as primary victims, the vulnerable, usual women and children. There's more to it. And the manner in which mediation teams have been constituted, women had a limited participation. And that was a question that was being raised. Then the following question, but we don't have women who have been trained, so let's develop a program. And the program was developed. To date, a court has participated in that program together with the AU, which had a program of its own, but also together with UN Women, who took an interest in this, and they said we are going to be active and contribute towards identification and training of women. The RACs started doing the same. We've got FemWise units everywhere. It's happening. Here at DIRCO, there was a program under the Gertrude Chopin, that thing. There's a training that happens every year. I participate in it. We have a rostrum. Now, two problems we've identified. The people who are identified to come for training are those who are not available for deployment. That's problem number two. Because they never get deployed because they go back to the work they've been doing. And we said you can't treat the training of women in mediation, peace and security as a holiday or a break. So that when they finish, they go back to the normal work that they've been doing. They are not in the field, and they want to go into the field. This is the current debate and decision. Let's deploy women in the field to go and do the work. It's still going on. The UN, if you look at some of the representative of the special representative of the Secretary General, they've been women from Europe, all over these peacekeeping missions here in Africa. And who come in to be part of the civilian component? It's men and women from Europe. Where are our African women? Why are we not pulling them in? Where is the problem? These are the problems that we must address. So that these things become a reality. It's not just empty slogans in terms of what needs to be done. We have had that experience with Burundi, we have had the experience with the DRC, we have the experience elsewhere. The sharing of information amongst women, how it emerged as part of that. South African women in dialogue, sharing experience of how women in South Africa found their place into the negotiations and influencing the constitution. And the issues of women being there in that constitution written from the time of negotiations, exchanging those experiences, training that you have this thing going on. It's going on, but it does not end where the objective as defined is supposed to be. So it's something that we really honestly have to take up and make sure that it happens. Otherwise, we'll continue to limp. And it's becoming even more difficult now. And that's why we need more hands on deck. And particularly if dealing with local conflicts. People who understand local conflicts better are women. Because they are in the theater there. Whatever the nature of the conflict, they are there. I don't know sometimes where the men are. It's a difficult question to answer in some cases. But they are there. And that's why they become a factor when you talk about any conflict. Women are recognized to be there in the theater, be it as victims or largely victims and humanitarian case or whatever. So I'm saying that thing must change, and it has to change. You can't take decisions and not implement them. They have to be implemented. And I know there are a lot of women who are prepared to do that work, and who are ready. And we have been capable, and we produce results where they were deployed, even in peacekeeping. Women acquitted themselves very well in very difficult situations. So this thing of underestimating the capability and capacity of women is at our own disadvantage and peril. We are doing ourselves a very serious dishonor, if one can put it lightly. Ambassador, Amahor, Makurmaki, Mr. Chair. No, we're talking French, don't worry. Ambassador, you know, you've raised a very, very, very critical question. At the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, there was an outcomes document. It was first a document that was prepared by a team appointed by Kofi Annan called In Larger Freedoms, to deal with the challenges facing the United Nations at 50 and what should happen. When the question of the reform of the Security Council was being pushed firmly on the agenda, and the attended problems of what you have correctly identified, of the recurring conflicts, then the proposal came out. They said maybe what we need, it's a peace-building commission so that we can focus. And the decision was taken then that 3 countries will be the test case: Burundi, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. That was a decision. I was still working at the UN. They were seconded there from when I was in Burundi, and they told me from there to go to the UN. So I went to the UN. I raised the question of Burundi once again. It was in my interest. And of course, these other two, with my other partner, was dealing with the other part of Africa. And it was agreed. So those who were responsible for us, who were responsible for this program, after the decision was taken, which was called a bonus because it was not expected that anything like that will emerge. When the decision was taken, the P5, the Security Council, mobilized the other members who were there at that time, that the Peace Building Commission, as agreed, must be established in the office of the Secretary General, but expanded to also include the Security Council, because you will be dealing with countries that have been on the agenda of the Security Council, so that it becomes a concrete thing. How do you move from there? Typical of the UN, there was a tussle that began. And you know the history of Burundi, even in relation to this. When Burundi started raising the question, when are we being removed from the agenda of the Security Council? Because we've done the part we're supposed to have done. We have now to be a beneficiary of this Peace Building Commission, because we've been told we must prepare ourselves, documentation and everything, with the assistance of the UN agencies on the ground. That's what is happening in all the countries. 2 challenges. So we went to this problematic committee called the 5th Committee to make the presentation on the funding of the Peace Building Office, because the commission was agreed with the expansion that the Security Council demanded, which was a problem in itself. Agreed. But also, there was a question of how then do you ensure that when the Security Council mandate comes to an end, a peacekeeping mission departs the scene after it has completed its task, you then have a peace-building office on the ground. Agreed. Department of Political Affairs was supposed to be responsible for that. Typical to that competition, Department of Peacekeeping Operations resisted. And no, we still want to maintain control and a presence. The Security Council agreed. So it did not have that political office that will manage that. You had an office whose mandate was skewed. That's why Burundi took a bit of time before things moved. Sierra Leone and that thing. Nothing happened. So they said two things. Funding. They said, yes, it has been agreed, it's correct. A decision was taken by the summit. We have looked at the issue and the proposals that we are making. And we think the practical thing to do is that the peace-building office must be funded from voluntary contributions, not assessed contributions like peacekeeping, voluntary contributions. Now, if these voluntary contributions, it created a problem because the countries that would be prepared, which were mainly Scandinavian countries, were already funding some programs of the UNDP and country teams on the ground, which the countries that came up with proposals of areas where they needed intervention for peace-building purposes, already those were on the ground, and this country said, no, but we're already doing this. So the ticking of the box began. So even with the will that was there from these voluntary contributions, very little happened. When that office was established, there could not even be money for the staff to man it, the peace-building office. It had Kofi Annan had to ask the UNDP to release 2 Africans to come into that office so that they can be the key managers of that program, because they had the experience of dealing with these issues on the ground as UNDP people. They were indeed seconded. It started limping. Only recently, again, a decision was taken to revisit the issue of peace-building commission because of the issues that we're raising, because of complaints that have been continuously coming up, conflicts that were recurring, because what you correctly mentioned as it identified in the root causes, which are the structural problems. How do you begin to deal with those? Those are the hard issues that needed to be attended to. And your so-called development partners, they were not interested in that one. They were not. You know the problems you had with the EU and the others and the conditions they put. Only after President Nkurunziza left us that they said, okay, President Evariste, we think we can make certain concessions. But only if you are going to agree that you reduce your forces in Somalia. Central African Republic, they didn't touch it there. Somalia, because the dollars that Burundi was benefiting from, limited dollars that came as part of this contribution, is reimbursement for the peacekeeping troops that it had deployed in Somalia. If you reduce that, you reduce the capacity of Burundi to access foreign currency. So it was a continuation of sanctions in a veiled manner because they couldn't get Burundi to do what they wanted. They were resisting certain things. And this is the reality, and these are the challenges that South Africa is now back. We are part of the Peace Building Commission. And those questions are back again, they're being raised. As to how far we'll be able to move and to what extent, and even the P3 within the Security Council have been raising the issues, is part of the issue that the Secretary General has been raising in his new agenda for peace, which is being resisted in certain quarters. Let's see what happens, and hope that we can be able to move and shift that needle to where it's supposed to be, so that the compass is accurate. There's too many magnets with this errant foreign interference, so the needle is moving too much in the wrong directions. It should be steady, so that we go where we have decided to go. So it's not going to be now, Ambassador. Let's focus on other issues and continue to fight on this one, and take advantage of your presence here in your interaction and engagement with DIRCO to reinforce our ambassador there, to be able to say, there is, and your ambassador at the UN, you must be able to say to it, push, we'll support you, and we need your support, make your demands, we'll also have to support, because it's for a limited period. And not all of us are sensitive to the same extent in terms of what needs to be done, in terms of the issues that you are raising. We know them, some of us. I spent my whole diplomatic life for 10 years. I've been focusing on Burundi until I stayed there for about the last 3 years of my 10 years. So the time I spent at the AU, it was on Burundi and the DRC, but largely in Burundi. When the African mission was established, I was seconded there. I stayed in Burundi. The UN took me from there when we were. So Burundi is part of me. I can feel you, I understand what you are saying. I'm responding in the manner in which I'm responding. Other people will understand me, why I'm responding in that way to you from the explanation I'm giving. That is something that is very close to my heart, and it's a betrayal that is unacceptable, because it was agreed. It was agreed. And that is part of the challenge of the UN system. We have to make it work for us.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think I have to cut our discussions short and questions short, because our tummies are rumbling and the information has been substantial. I'd like to thank Ambassador Nhlapo for engaging in conversation and dialogue with me, and for sharing his insights on your questions as well as mine on all these issues, and to do so with such eloquence and with such clarity, I think is an honor and a privilege to have been a part of. So I personally thank you, and also thank you on behalf of the audience, both online and here present, that you've done an excellent job of answering some or all of our questions. Thank you, Ambassador Nhlapo. It's on that note that I'd want to hand over my duties to Prof. Mello to wrap up today's event. Thank you.
I'm sure he wants to come back here.
All right. Kwesi, maybe, Prof. Kwesi, maybe let me start with you. I'm sure you, the days leading to today, you have spent a lot of time working, sleepless nights, and finally it's happening. Finally we're getting the wisdom, and thanks to you. Ambassador, when you started with your discussion, you actually said you wish you were an academic. And I must tell you that what you gave us today was more intellectually stimulating. You are the type of person that I will invite into my classroom to teach my international relations students about international relations. Because you're not learning it from the book. You have lived experiences that you were sharing with us today. And in fact, as you were outlining and explaining, responding to questions, we were also asking ourselves so many questions, and I'm sure in the minds of the audience there are so many questions. The question of leadership in Africa, in South Africa. Do we have the right leaders who can do resource mobilization? What is happening in Niger is basically about the issue of beneficiation. This is an issue that we've been talking about so long in South Africa. We talk about it, but no action is really happening. The issue of resource mobilization, you spoke about having peace. How can you have peace if you are dependent on another country for resources? What is it that we're doing in order to mobilize resources internally within Africa? As Africans, as African countries, we become rich beggars. These beggars are going to America for AGOA to say, can you give us something? These rich countries go to Russia to say, can we talk about how rice can come to Africa? Yes, yet in terms of the land that we have vast land, arable, maybe we have a problem of rain, but we have land. Why can't this land be able to feed us?
60%.
Yes. So perhaps, maybe as we ponder about tomorrow, we also need to do introspection when we talk about BRICS. When we talk about multilateral organizations, we always have to start with ourselves. Do some introspection. What is it that we are doing about ourselves in order to be better partners in as far as multilateral organizations are concerned? And again, the truth is that we always have to be on the lookout for possibility of neo-colonialization. It may come in a number of help that is coming piecemeal, to say that we're going to build your road there, we're going to build you something. Ultimately, you are in debt and you can't get out of that debt. And therefore, you are beholden to that particular country that is helping you. So it is important that some of these debates, we take them forward tomorrow. And I hope Ambassador is still going to be there. The other ambassador is also going to be there tomorrow, so that we continue with this intellectual engagement. And I must also thank you as audience, because your role is very important. As academics, as practitioners, I'm sure you're also taking notes today, because today I actually was a student of Ambassador. Because I was also taking notes, I was actually jotting down a number of research questions that need to be engaged beyond this forum. And at this point, let me thank you, and let me also invite you for lunch, because lunch is served outside. Please clap hands for yourself, because you've been a very good audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think we can go to lunch now.
Thank you so much. I'm quickly logging into